Welcome everyone and good morning to the first audit meeting of the Audit Committee since the election. My name is Margaret Anslow. I'm Labour Councillor and convener of this Audit Committee. We will now start following the agenda. Do we have any apologies?
No, convener, we've got no apologies for today.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest? Take that as a no. Next item, the minutes for agreement. Councillor Meikle-John.
Thank you, convener. I'm happy to agree. Possibly I may be the only person that was at the last meeting, so I think you'll just need to take my word for it as a true and accurate record.
Thank you, Councillor. And next item is the actual accounts. Amanda, if you'd please.
Thank you, convener. So the purpose today is to ask the committee to consider the unaudited accounts. That's what's been presented today. And as we discussed during our training last week, the accounts are subject to Local Authority Accounts Regulations 2014, which is quite prescriptive in terms of the timeframes that the unaudited accounts should be completed and considered by the Audit Committee. The accounts have to be completed by the 30th of June and passed to the auditor by that date, and the council met that deadline. The Audit Committee have to then consider the unaudited accounts by the 31st of August, and this meeting is to fulfil that requirement. There's also the requirement to notify the public that the accounts are available for inspection, and that inspection period must last for 3 weeks. So in our case, the inspection period was from the 30th of June to the 20th of July, and the public have the option to make an objection to the accounts, and they would lodge that with our auditors, who are EY, and Grace is here today, but no objections were lodged. If I just turn to the accounts themselves, I'm just going to pick up on a couple of areas to highlight, mainly from the management commentary and a little bit on the annual governance statement. So the management commentary, as we talked about in training, is really there to summarise the key messages about the council's performance, and that's financial and non-financial. And it should give a fair view of the council's position, so it's not us just saying all our best bits. It's more difficult this year, I think, due to the elections and the new members. But what I would say, and I think I said in training, is that in future years, what you're reading in the management commentary should reflect your knowledge and experience of what you've heard at committees and councils and the information that's sort of passed in front of you. There are some key messages and areas that members will be aware of, however. So there's quite a lot of reference made to the best value action plan, some in the management commentary, but particularly in the annual governance statement. And that's obviously a big focus of our work right now. So for instance, there's not a lot of information on performance. There's some information on non-financial performance in the management commentary, but not a lot. There's some benchmarking information shown on page 17 of the agenda. But there is a link to the Falkirk Performs website, which is the council's main platform for reporting on performance. And what we're trying to do is constantly sort of strike a balance between ensuring there's sufficient information in the management commentary to make sure that a fair picture is presented, but also trying not to make the accounts even more lengthy than they need to be, because they're currently nearly 100 pages, which is a lot for anyone to digest. In terms of financial performance in the management commentary, the figures that are presented should be familiar to everyone, because it would reflect what's presented in June, both in terms of revenue and capital. A few points to highlight. The council had budgeted for a deficit in 21-22 of £2 million, but in the event we had a much better outturn. Our outturn was a surplus of 6.9, so a movement of 8.9 million. And the main reason for that variance, we touched on that briefly during our training session and at the June executive, and it's also set out on page 19 of the agenda. So that leaves the general fund uncommitted reserves at 31st of March 2022 at 16.7 million. And as discussed at training and the executive in June, members had approved the use of £5 million of these reserves during 22-23. But the management commentary is setting out that the financial pressures facing the council could mean that there's a much higher call on reserves during the year. The housing revenue account for 21-22 included a planned deficit of 600,000 to be met from reserves, and that was the outturn for the housing revenue account. And in terms of capital, there was spend of 42.4 million in the general fund and 35.9 million on the housing side. Page 23 of the agenda touches on some of the financial indicators, and hopefully some of those will be familiar to you from the Treasury training that we did last week. So I won't go into those in very much detail or at all. But moving on to the annual governance statement briefly, that's a really important statement for the Audit Committee to consider. And again, it should reflect your understanding of the Council's governance arrangements and control framework and the reports that are passing by your desk. Section 2 of the statement, which is page 29 in the agenda, sets out the Council's risk and assurance framework, and section 3 looks at the adequacy and effectiveness of the governance framework. Now, we haven't had our more detailed audit committee training yet, but we will have that before the next meeting of the audit committee, and we will have further training which will cover some of those areas. Section 4 of the annual governance statement highlights some challenges and actions that are to be taken in 22-23. An audit committee will want some assurance throughout the year that these actions are taking place as planned. And again, much of the work in that action plan relates back to the best value audit and the subsequent action plan. So in terms of the audit process, the audit process is currently underway. We are aware of some potential changes to the accounts, but at this stage, nothing that will materially affect the outturn position. There's not to say that that might not change as the audit continues, but at this point in time, we're not aware of anything that would affect that reserves figure. There are some issues with accounting for infrastructure assets, and that's a UK-wide issue, and that is likely to delay the completion of the audit, and that's because we're really waiting for some technical guidance on how to deal with that, but that's a national issue. So we're waiting for some guidance on what, if any, changes we need to make to our accounts to deal with this infrastructure issue. And it's really a sort of technical accounting issue about how we value our road network. So because of the sums involved, that could be quite material, but again, unlikely to affect our bottom line, but it just means that we might have a delay. The regulations normally ask for the accounts to be audited and considered by the Audit Committee and approved by Council by the 30th of September. For the 21-22 accounts, that requirement's extended to the 31st of October. So it may well be the case, because of the timings, that we need to have a special council to consider and approve the accounts to make sure that we meet the regulations. But we'll hopefully know more in the next couple of weeks in terms of that guidance and the impact it's going to have on the time frame. But at this point, we're not really masters of our own destiny with that. So I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Grace, do you wish to ask anything?
Good morning, everybody. I don't think I want to ask anything. I wondered if it would be helpful just to explain a little bit more about that infrastructure problem, just to explain that it's not a Falkirk Council problem at all. So the infrastructure assets at the moment, they are held at historic cost basis, which just basically means that the price that the council has paid for them is what is reflected in the financial statements. But that's a really big number just now, so that's about I think it's about 140 million for Falkirk Council just now. The problem that has arisen, and it came from down south, is that when the council buys more, so replaces parts of the road network, then that balance is just being added on to the value, to the value of the account. And we tend to think about valuations like a house valuation. So if your house was valued at £100,000, say, and you buy a new kitchen that costs maybe £15,000, then the value of your house won't automatically go up by that £15,000. There will be an element of you already had a kitchen, so you've got to take out that value, sorry, that existing value, to revalue your house. So this has been historic and has gone on and on for years and years and years, and nobody's noticed because it was only maybe about 5 years ago that roads actually came onto the balance sheet. So the problem that we have nationally, and this is across the UK, is that some of that record keeping is really, really old, and that lots of people have just been doing this historically. And because it's a huge value and our materiality is quite small, then there is that risk that there could be a material adjustment in there. So what Audit Scotland and the Scottish Government are trying to do is to come up with a statutory mitigation that would mean that that's okay, that that it doesn't impact the accounts, because at the moment we would have to give a limitation of scope opinion, which is like a qualified opinion, which we don't want to get to. So this is effectively the Scottish Government's approach to getting rid of it. At the end of the day, the value of fixed assets makes no difference to lots of things. So it doesn't make any difference to the value of council tax. It would just be a kind of technical in and out in the accounts. So it's not a great worry for the council. It's not a great worry for your reserves. It's purely a technical accounting issue. We always say we always have one of these once a year. There's always a banana skin, and this is this year's banana skin. At least it's not pensions this year. But I'm happy to take any more questions on that. But other than that, thank you and welcome.
Is there any questions from any members? Councillor Meikle-John, if you want to go first.
Thank you, convener. It just struck me that we've changed the way we've done the accounts over the years, and the visual indicators I think help the understanding because they are very complex. But there are aspects of information in here that any member of the public could be kind of questioned, particularly around the usable reserves, earmarked and unearmarked. And there's some big figures, for example, on page 22, if you look at the balance sheet, it talks about the usable reserves of 68.8 million, and that's not actually available for us to spend on what we like, because there is certain things we have to do. And I don't know whether Amanda can maybe explain a wee bit more around the usable reserves, earmarked reserves, and just around these figures and how we get to them.
Yeah, thank you. So the usable reserves is, I think we talked a little bit about this in our training last week. So we have usable reserves and unusable reserves, and usable reserves are effectively cash backed, and unusable reserves are Grace was talking about sort of statutory mitigation, technical accounting type arrangements. So there's no cash at the back of them. So in terms of the usable reserves, it is a high figure. And I'm just trying to look. I've got the accounts in front of me, which has page 55. I'm just trying to check what page that is on your agenda. It is page 69 on your agenda, and that breaks down the 68.7 million of usable reserves. So it shows you that we have our general fund reserve, which is 57.7 million, which I'll come back to. Our insurance fund. So our insurance fund is there to help mitigate against any particular liabilities that may come up. The insurance fund is actuarially valued every 3 years to make sure we've got enough money to settle claims that we have. So that insurance fund is kept under review on a regular basis. There's the capital receipts reserves. any assets that we sell, we'll receive a capital receipt. We have to keep those reserves separate. We can't use those for sort of anything we want. We can only use them for capital purposes. So that's not money that's available to us. There's the repairs and renewals reserve, which is the reserve that we keep for repairs and renewals to our property. And then we've got our capital grants and receipts unapplied account. And again, that is things like bits of capital receipt or planning obligations, but things that are ring fenced for capital purposes, so we can't use them for revenue. So that's the kind of high level breakdown of the 68.7 million. In terms of that general fund reserve of 57.7 million, that's when, as Councillor Mika John saying, it then gets broken down between what's earmarked and what's uncommitted. And that breakdown is also on that same page, just a bit further down. So you've got the general fund uncommitted reserve of 16.7 million that we've reported. You also have the HRA reserve in there, so that's all sort of brought together under that general fund reserve figure, but actually it is distinct and we can only use it for housing purposes, and that's 7.2 million. We have grant funding in there of 11.3 million. Again, that will be ring-fenced grants, will be specific purposes for which we need to use that, or it will be timing in terms of the grants. The other sort of chunky figure in there particularly is 16 million of COVID grants that we've referred to in our June report. And that's all the COVID funding that we had received, but we hadn't yet used. But we plan to apply a significant portion of that in 22-23. We've also referenced the fact that we know that there's sort of roughly £4 million for education recovery ring fenced within that, and Children's Services are going through to look through how we could apply that in year and what we could get some benefit from that funding, how we could get benefit from that funding. So of that large figure of 68.7 million, there's only actually 16.7 million which is not committed, and that's the figure that we've reported in the June exec. I think one of the perennial issues that there are with the accounts is how you make them, how you comply with all the statutory reporting requirements, which will include terminology in terms of usable reserves, unusable reserves, committed reserves, all these kind of things. It's how you comply with all of that, but make the accounts as sort of understandable and easy to navigate as possible. I don't think we've cracked that. I'm not sure anyone's really cracked that. Every now and then, SIPFA do a sort of back to basics, let's review this, but it's incredibly difficult. And really the management commentary was part of the solution to that, to try and provide a sort of narrative report at the beginning, which we can really shape into something that's a bit more sort of understandable to people picking up the accounts. We do have issues with that at the moment. We've kind of put lots of different graphics and things in. That's causing other types of issues because some of this doesn't comply with accessibility rules. In terms of, you know, if you were using a document reader, you would struggle with those graphics. So we're working with the accessibility team to see what we can do, but actually a lot of places are starting to strip out the graphics and the colour and things like that because that's not accessible online for people. So it's something that we're all grappling with, but it is tricky. Thank you.
Councillor Mika John, do you have anything else to add, ask?
No, I've nothing else at this time, convener.
Okay, does any other members wish to ask anything at all? I take it that's a no. Can I ask how realistic it will be to reschedule the next meeting, given the delay in the accounts coming back?
Thank you, convener. We've already started to talk to Brian about potential dates and things like that. So I think it will be achievable. I think it's just getting some more clarity on what a likely time frame is before we set those dates. But there are a few options for us.
Thank you, Amanda. The only comment from me is I actually quite like your management commentary. I wouldn't like to see it stripped, but I understand the reasons. As an equalities unionist, I understand the reasons behind the stripping of some. Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if there's no further questions, then I'll close this meeting. Thank you very much for your attendance.